The prairie stretched wide and endless, its golden grasses bending beneath the whisper of the evening wind. The horizon burned with the last light of the setting sun, casting long shadows that made the land look as if it held secrets older than memory itself. In that wild silence, broken only by the cry of a hawk and the distant low of cattle, she carried her promise like armor. She had sworn never to give herself away, never to let her heart be captured. For she had seen too many women lose themselves in the name of love and regret it. Her vow was her shield, her protection against loneliness and against betrayal. But out here on the edge of the American frontier, vows had a way of being tested. She was not fragile, though some might have thought so at first glance. Her dress, worn and simple, clung to her like a second skin dusted from long days of travel and work. Her hands carried the marks of both survival and stubbornness. Every step she took spoke of a will to endure. The prairie was no place for the faint-hearted, and she had learned to read its moods as one might read a person's face. The change in the wind, the stir in the grass, the hush that fell over the land, these were her companions. Yet no matter how she tried to live only for herself, the world had its own designs, and fate sometimes rode in on the back of a horse. That evening, when the sun seemed to melt into the horizon, she first saw him. The Apache warrior stood tall and fierce, his presence like a flame in the fading light. His hair was long, braided with beads that caught the last glimmer of the day. His chest, broad and strong, bore scars that spoke of battles fought and won. He carried a spear as if it were an extension of his arm, not just a weapon but a symbol of who he was. There was a silence in him too, but not the kind born of fear or hesitation. His silence was weight, a quiet strength that spoke more than words ever could. And when his eyes found hers across the prairie, something in her vow trembled. For a heartbeat, neither moved. She stood with her chin lifted, her breath caught somewhere between fear and wonder. He studied her as though he could see beyond the surface, as if he knew the story written in her soul. She had heard of Apache warriors, whispered tales of their skill, their loyalty to their people, their wild courage. She had also heard the warnings, the stories twisted by fear. But as the evening light carved his figure against the land, none of those tales mattered. What she saw was not a legend or a danger, it was a man, alive with purpose, bound to the earth in a way she had never known. Still, her vow echoed inside her like a warning bell. She could not let herself be drawn into something that might undo her. She reminded herself of the women she had seen broken by promises made and broken again. Love, she told herself, was a snare. And yet, her heart beat faster, her breath shallow, as if her very body refused to obey the walls she had built. She pressed her hands against her dress, trying to ground herself. But the land around her seemed to whisper differently now. The prairie had shifted, and she was no longer standing alone. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, like a predator, careful not to startle its prey. Yet there was no cruelty in his movements. There was curiosity, a question left unspoken. The space between them closed with each stride, and she felt the world narrow until it was only the two of them, their lives brushing against something greater than either could command. When he finally stopped, the air itself felt charged, alive with something neither of them could name. His eyes did not wander. They held hers, steady, unflinching, as if asking whether she was ready to see herself as he saw her. She wanted to turn away, to break the spell before it grew into something she could not escape. But her body betrayed her, rooted to the earth, unable to flee. Her heart pounded against her ribs as though trying to leap free. The vow that had guarded her for so long began to feel like a cage instead of protection. And though she had sworn never to give herself, she realized in that moment that promises made in solitude could falter when tested against the fire of another soul. The prairie around them seemed to fall into deeper silence. Even the wind held its breath. She felt the weight of the land, the sky, the fading sun, all of it pressing down as though the world itself demanded an answer. She did not speak, for her voice would have betrayed too much. And he did not move further, though she sensed he could have. Instead, he waited, letting the silence stretch like a bowstring pulled tight. Ready to release, the moment lingered, trembling between choice and fate. And in her chest, the war between vow and desire burned hotter than the dying sun. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, nor what dangers might come from opening herself to him. She only knew that something had begun, something neither of them could turn away from now. And as the prairie shadows swallowed the last light, she wondered if her heart would betray her vow completely before dawn. Would she stand by the promise she had carried so long? Or would she find herself falling into the eyes of the Apache warrior, her soul no longer her own? The answer hung in the air, suspended, waiting for the next breath, the next choice, the next step into a story that could never be undone. The night wrapped itself around the prairie, a heavy blanket of shadow pierced only by the glow of the moon. She felt the air cool against her skin, yet the warmth in her chest lingered, left there by the memory of his gaze. She tried to shake it off, tried to remind herself of the vow she had carried since leaving behind everything she once knew. It had been made out of necessity, out of pain and fear, forged like iron to protect her from a world that took too easily. And yet one look from him had already weakened its edge. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned her face from the horizon, as if she could will the memory away. But the image of the Apache warrior stood firm in her mind. His silence had said more than any words could, and that silence now haunted her. The land was quiet, but not dead. Coyotes sang in the distance, their sharp cries carrying across the plains. Somewhere, a horse shifted, its hooves brushing against the earth. The prairie had always been her companion, vast and endless, teaching her both patience and caution. Yet tonight it felt different, alive in a way that unsettled her. She walked back toward the small camp she had made, the fire burning low, casting flickers of orange against the darkness. She told herself she would not see him again, that this encounter had been nothing more than a crossing of paths. But deep down she knew fate did not waste moments so powerful. It had tied their lives together with invisible threads. And whether she wanted it or not, the story had already begun. She sat by the fire and thought of the journey that had brought her here. The old wagon trail still cut through her memory, lined with the faces of those who had traveled alongside her once. Some had found new beginnings on this land. Others had not survived the harsh seasons. The prairie was both gift and punishment. It gave freedom to those who dared, but it also demanded everything in return. She had learned to build her life from scraps, to trust her instincts above all else. She had learned to live without expecting kindness. Yet now, she felt as though all that learning was being tested. What place did a vow have when the land itself seemed to push her towards something she had not asked for? The warrior's presence clung to her thoughts like smoke. Who was he beyond the image she had seen? What life had carved those scars on his body? What stories were hidden behind the strength in his eyes? She had grown up hearing words about his people, some spoken in fear, others in admiration. But they had always been stories told from a distance. Now that distance was gone, and the reality was far different than the whispers of settlers and travelers. There was no mistaking the power in him, the way he seemed bound to the earth, as though he were a part of it. She wondered if he carried vows of his own, promises forged in battle or loss. The thought unsettled her even more. It's because it meant he might be just as untouchable as she tried to be. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of smoke and wild grass. She lay down near the fire, her eyes tracing the stars above. The sky on the prairie had always been her solace, its wide stretch a reminder that her troubles were small compared to the endless heavens. Tonight, though, it felt like a mirror. The stars seemed to watch her, silent witnesses to the storm inside her chest. She shut her eyes, trying to find rest, but sleep came only in pieces. Broken by dreams of shadows moving through the tall grass, of eyes catching hers in the dark. Each time she woke, the fire had burned lower. And each time she wondered if he was out there still. Watching, waiting, morning came with a sharp chill. The kind that bitted her fingers and made her breath show in pale wisps. She rose, gathering her few belongings, preparing to move on, as she always did. The prairie never let one stay too long in comfort. It pushed you forward, urged you to keep searching, to keep surviving. She tied her hair back, tightened the strap of her pack, and set her eyes on the trail ahead. Yet every step she took felt heavier than usual, as if the land itself resisted her leaving. Her heart told her the same, whispering that she was walking away from something she was meant to face. She clenched her jaw and pressed on, repeating her vow in her mind, the words like iron nails keeping her steady. By midday, the sun was high, beating down with relentless heat. She found shade beneath a stand of cottonwoods, their branches swaying gently. As she drank from her canteen, the silence of the place struck her again. It was not empty. It was watchful. She sensed movement, faint but certain, the kind that came from being observed. Her pulse quickened. She turned, scanning the tall grass, the tree line, the distant hills, but saw nothing. Still, she knew she was not alone. The feeling was too strong, too certain to be imagination. She pressed her back against the tree, gripping the knife at her belt, and waited. The prairie had taught her patience. Patience was sometimes the difference between life and death. The wait stretched, the air thick with tension. Then, just as she thought perhaps she had been mistaken, he appeared. Not suddenly, but with the quiet grace of someone who belonged to the land itself. The Apache warrior stepped from the shadows, his eyes steady, his movements measured. He did not raise his weapon. He did not need to. His presence was enough. She tightened her grip on the knife, though a part of her knew it was foolish. If he had meant her harm, she would not have seen him coming at all. Still, instinct pushed her to hold her ground. Their eyes locked once more, and the silence between them stretched like it had before, carrying weight, carrying questions. She wanted to speak, to demand why he followed, what he wanted, but the words froze on her tongue. His gaze was unreadable, and yet it held something more than curiosity. It was as though he studied not just her face, but the truth she carried inside. She felt exposed, as if he could see the vow she had sworn and the fear behind it. And in that moment, she realized her story was no longer hers alone. He had stepped into it, uninvited, but with a force she could not deny. She lowered the knife slowly, her hand trembling. His eyes flicked to it, then back to hers, a silent acknowledgement that he understood her caution. But he still did not move closer. He simply stood there, the spear resting against his shoulder, his stance one of patience and certainty. She wondered how long he had been watching her, how much of her journey he had already witnessed. Had he seen her fragile moments, the times when loneliness pressed so hard it felt like it might break her? The thought both unsettled and comforted her. For the first time, she was not entirely invisible on this vast land. The wind shifted again, rustling the leaves, carrying the smell of earth and grass. It filled the silence between them, but it did not ease the tension. She swallowed hard, torn between the vow that had protected her and the pull that now urged her toward him. Every instinct told her to run, to keep moving, to hold fast to the promise she had made. Yet something deeper whispered that running would change nothing. He would still be there, in her thoughts, in the shadow of every horizon. She turned her face toward the trees, breaking eye contact for the first time. But even then she felt the weight of his gaze. When she finally looked back, he was gone. The space he had filled stood empty, the grass swaying gently where he had been. Yet she knew he had not truly left. He was still there, somewhere close, watching as always. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the beat of her heart, fast and restless. The vow she had sworn seemed to grow heavier by the moment, no longer a shield, but a burden. And as she stepped back onto the trail, the sun sinking lower in the sky, she felt the story closing in around her, its threads weaving tighter, pulling her toward a fate she could neither see nor escape. What she did not yet know was that the prairie itself had chosen this path for her. And the man she feared and longed for, in equal measure, was not done with her. Their story had only just begun. Already the land whispered of storms yet to come. The days that followed carried an unease she could not shake. Every time the wind stirred the tall grass, she thought of him. Every sound in the distance seemed to hold his presence, quiet and certain, like the land itself had conspired to keep him near. She tried to push the thought away, to focus on the work of survival, the gathering of water, The building of fire, the endless watching of the horizon, but no matter how she tried, her mind returned to him. The Apache warrior was not just a man who had crossed her path. He was becoming a shadow stitched into her every moment. A reminder that her vow was not as unbreakable as she once believed. The prairie was not without danger, and perhaps that was why she felt his presence most keenly when she was most vulnerable. One afternoon, as the sun beat down mercilessly, she caught sight of movement in the distance. At first, she thought it was only buffalo crossing the plains, their dark bodies low against the grasses. But as she narrowed her eyes, she saw rider settlers like herself, though not the kind she trusted. She knew their type. Drifters who claimed land, not with honesty, but with the edge of a blade. Men who carried rifles not only for hunting, but for taking what did not belong to them. She stayed low, crouching near the line of brush, watching them pass. Her heart thudded with the reminder that she was alone. A woman traveling without the shield of family or numbers. When the riders disappeared, she allowed herself to breathe again, though the fear lingered. She could not know if they had seen her camp, if they would circle back when night fell. It was in moments like this that her vow felt both like armor and curse. She had sworn never to depend on another, never to tie her fate to a man. Yet the truth was, the prairie was harsh, and sometimes even the strongest spirit could not hold against the weight of the unknown. She felt the pull of contradiction, wanting no one, yet aching for someone she could trust, when danger whispered around her. That night, firelight flickered low, and she felt the eyes on her again. She turned, knife in hand, her body tense. He stood there, quiet as always, his figure caught in the glow of the flames. This time, she did not startle. A part of her had expected him. He stepped closer, the spear resting across his shoulders, his face unreadable in the shifting light. For a long moment, neither spoke. It was as if words would only weaken what hung in the air between them. She lowered the knife slowly, though she did not put it away. He inclined his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. It was enough to tell her he had seen the danger she had seen earlier, and that he was here because of it. She wanted to ask him why. Why he lingered near her camp. Why he did not pass on like any other traveler. Why he carried this unspoken bond between them as if it were his to keep. But the words would not form. Instead, she watched him settle onto the ground near the edge of the firelight. His body still, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. He did not intrude further. He did not demand her trust. He simply sat, and the silence between them spoke volumes. She understood then that he was both a shield and a storm. His presence could guard her, but it could also undo her in ways she was not ready to admit. By morning, he was gone again. Only the pressed grass where he had sat gave proof he had been there. Yet she felt stronger for it, though she told herself she should not. Her vow burned against her heart, whispering that to lean on him, even in silence, was a betrayal of everything she had sworn. Still, the memory of his watchful eyes eased the fear that had coiled in her chest. She continued her journey with renewed steps, though she knew she was not truly alone. As days stretched into weeks, the land itself became part of their story. Sometimes she would catch sight of him at a distance, riding along the ridge or moving through the trees. Other times, she would wake to find the faintest signs of his presence tracks in the dirt, a broken branch where he had passed. He never came too close, but he never left entirely. It was a strange dance, one that unsettled her vow even more. She began to feel as though the prairie itself wove them together, keeping him always just near enough to remind her of the choice she refused to make. The settlers she had feared soon returned, their horses tearing the silence of the plains. This time, they did not pass by. They came with loud voices and hungry eyes, searching for camps to plunder, food to take, and lives to control. She hid as best she could, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they found her. When the moment came, she stood her ground, knife in hand, her heart pounding. The men circled her, their laughter cruel, their intent clear. She braced herself for the worse, for the breaking of her vow, not by choice, but by force. Yet before they could strike, he appeared. The Apache warrior came like the wind, swift and fierce, his spear flashing in the fading light. The settlers stumbled back, startled by the sudden fury in their midst. He fought not with reckless rage, but with a precision born of countless battles. His presence turned the tide before blood could be spilled. The settlers fled, shouting curses into the dusk, their bravado broken. She stood frozen, her knife trembling in her hand, her breath shallow. He had saved her, yet in doing so, he had also deepened the conflict inside her. Gratitude pulled at her heart, but so did fear. Fear of what it meant to let him stand between her and the dangers of this land. Fear of how easily her vow could fracture under the weight of his protection. That night, she did not sleep. The fire burned low as she sat across from him, the silence heavy with unspoken truths. He tended to his spear, his movements calm, his expression unreadable. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she asked the only question she could manage. Why? The single word hung in the air, trembling with meaning. Why had he followed her? Why had he fought for her? Why did he linger in the shadows of her journey? He did not answer with words. He looked at her, his gaze steady, and she felt the weight of his silence again. It was not an answer, but it was enough to tell her that whatever bound them was not fleeting. It was something deeper, something that would not be broken easily. She turned her face away, her vow screaming inside her chest. She had promised herself she would never belong to anyone, never give her heart where it could be broken. Yet here he was, tearing at the edges of that promise without even speaking. She felt both anger and longing, a storm she could not control. And as the night stretched on, she realized the conflict she carried was not just against him, but against herself. She was no longer fighting only the dangers of the prairie or the cruelty of men who roamed it. She was fighting the walls she had built around her own heart. The days that followed were filled with tension. He did not leave her now, though he kept a careful distance. They traveled through the same land, their paths running parallel, never touching, but never far apart. She grew accustomed to his presence, though she refused to admit it. Sometimes, when the nights grew too long, she would glance across the fire and find his eyes already on her. The silence stretched between them, thick with things neither dared to say. The land around them mirrored the struggle inside her, vast, untamed, full of promise and peril alike. Yet the prairie was not the only threat. Whispers carried on, the wind spoke of conflicts rising, settlers pushing deeper into the land, of Apache bands forced to fight for their home. She began to realize that his silence carried burdens she could not yet understand. His people faced struggles of their own, battles larger than the one inside her heart. The more she thought of it, the more she saw how small her vow seemed compared to the storms he carried. And yet it was her storm. It was the only shield she had. She could not lay it down, not even for him. But as she watched him move through the world, fierce and steadfast, she wondered how long she could hold to it before it shattered completely. The story pressed forward like the prairie wind, restless, unyielding, carrying them both toward something neither could escape. And with each passing day, the tension grew. A fire waiting to break into flame, a storm waiting to fall upon them both. The prairie seemed restless, as though it carried the weight of storms yet to break. Days stretched on, each one heavier than the last, filled with an uneasy silence that pressed hard against her chest. She could feel it in the way the birds took flight suddenly, the way the wind shifted without warning, and in the way the Apache warrior's eyes grew sharper with every passing mile. He no longer appeared just as a shadow on the horizon. He was near now, walking parallel to her journey, his presence no longer hidden. The land itself seemed to bring them closer, as if it knew that what was coming would demand more than she had ever given. The settlers had not forgotten her. She had seen signs of them again, hoofprints pressed into the earth, bits of broken glass left from their fires, a torn scrap of cloth caught in the brush. Each trace was a reminder that they were circling, waiting, searching. She knew they were the kind of men who thrived on fear, and fear was exactly what she refused to give them. Still, when night fell, she slept with her knife clutched in her hand, her eyes opening at the slightest sound. It was only the faint comfort of knowing he was near that kept her from being consumed by dread. Yet that comfort carried its own kind of torment. The vow she had sworn felt weaker now, but she clung to it all the more fiercely, as though holding on to it might keep her from losing herself completely. One evening, the sky turned red with the fire of the setting sun, and the air thickened with the smell of smoke. She followed the trail of it until she saw the charred remains of a homestead. The cabin was burned to the ground, the fields blackened, the silence heavy with loss. Her heart sank as she stepped through the ash. She had never met the family who had lived there, but their absence spoke louder than words. The prairie did not forgive weakness, and the cruelty of men finished what the land began. As she knelt in the ashes, she felt his presence again. He stood just beyond the ruin, silent as always, his eyes fixed on the horizon. For the first time, she saw something different in him. Not only strength, but sorrow. It struck her like a blade, because she understood then that he carried not just his own battles, but the weight of all his people's struggles. Her vow suddenly seemed selfish in comparison, and yet she could not let it go. Not yet. That night, they did not part ways. He stayed near her fire, closer than ever before. She could feel the heat of him across the flames. And though no words passed between them, the air was charged with things unsaid. She watched him as he sat sharpening his spear, the motion steady and precise. He carried himself with a kind of patience she could not fathom, as if he understood that everything in life required waiting the hunt, the battle, even the heart. She lay awake long after the fire had burned low, her thoughts a storm she could not quiet. She wanted to ask him what his silence meant, what he expected of her, but she could not bear to hear an answer. Instead, she listened to the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind, her heart beating too fast for rest. The following days tested them both. The settlers grew bolder, their tracks crossing hers again and again, until it was clear they were hunting more than food or land. They were hunting her. And each time danger brushed close, he was there. Sometimes it was only his shadow in the distance, sometimes the faint sound of his horse in the dark, but always. He was near enough to remind her that she was no longer standing alone. She wanted to hate him for it, to resent the way he stripped her vow of its strength, but the truth was harder. She needed him, whether she admitted it or not. And that truth threatened everything she had built her life upon. One night, the tension reached its peak. The moon was high, the prairie silver with its light, when the settlers struck. Their shouts broke the silence, their horses pounding across the earth as they descended upon her camp. She grabbed her knife, her breath sharp, her heart racing, knowing she could not fight them alone. And then he was there, the Apache warrior, his spear flashing in the moonlight as he moved with a deadly grace that left no space for hesitation. The clash was fierce, the night alive with the sound of steel and the cries of men. She fought too, her blade striking out in desperation, but it was his strength that turned the tide. Together, they drove the settlers back, their retreat loud with curses and threats of return. When the last hoofbeats faded into the distance, silence fell heavy again. She stood trembling, her knife slick in her hand, her chest heaving with each breath. He stood across from her, his body lit by the pale glow of the moon, his eyes burning with intensity. In that moment, she saw not only the warrior, but the man. The one who had chosen to stay near, who had fought for her without asking, who carried a strength that seemed to belong to both the earth and the sky. Her vow crumbled a little more under the weight of that truth, and she hated herself for it. She turned away, unable to face him, but she knew the battle was no longer only against the settlers. It was against her own heart. The prairie grew harsher as they pressed on, skies darkening with storms that rolled in without warning. Rain fell in torrents, drenching the land, turning the soil to mud. She struggled to keep her fire alive, to keep her food dry, but he weathered it with the ease of someone born to the land. He showed her without words how to find shelter, how to read the signs of the storm, how to endure. Each lesson brought them closer, though she fought against the closeness as much as she clung to it. She knew the prairie was testing her, not only with storms and hunger, but with the fire that grew each time she looked at him. In the quiet moments between storms, she learned pieces of his world. Not through his words, he spoke rarely, but through the way he moved, the way he hunted, the way he treated the land. She saw the pride he carried, the loyalty to his people, the scars that marked battles fought for more than just survival. She began to understand that his silence was not emptiness, but depth, a language of its own. And with that understanding came a fear she could not name, because she realized her vow had never accounted for a man like him. It had been built against betrayal, against weakness, against losing herself in promises. But he was not a promise. He was a force, and no vow could stand against him forever. The settlers returned once more, this time with greater numbers, their voices carrying across the plains like thunder. She knew the final clash was drawing near, the moment when everything would come to its peak. The prairie seemed to know it too. The winds grew stronger, the nights colder, the silence before dawn sharper than a blade. Each step she took felt like walking toward the edge of something vast and unstoppable. He stayed close now, no longer keeping his distance, his presence a constant reminder of the choice she would soon face. She could feel the storm gathering, not only in the land, but in her heart, pressing closer with every breath. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she stood watching the sky burn with colors of fire and ash. He came to stand beside her, his figure tall and steady, his silence heavier than ever. She wanted to speak, to confess the battle inside her, but the words refused to form. Instead, she stood there, the two of them side by side, the prairie stretching endless before them, knowing the climax of their story was near. The settlers were coming. The storm was rising, and the vow she had sworn so long ago was breaking under the weight of something far greater than she had ever imagined. The prairie held its breath, waiting, the air thick with anticipation. She could feel it in her bones. The moment that would decide everything was almost here. And as the first stars pierced the sky, she wondered if she was ready for what was to come, or if fate had already decided for her. The night before the storm broke, the prairie was unnaturally still. The stars shone sharp and clear, but the silence beneath them carried weight, as if the land itself braced for what was to come. She sat by the fire, her knife across her lap, her eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the flames. He was near, seated in the darkness where the glow did not touch, his spear resting against his shoulder. They had not spoken, not once, but the air between them was alive with things unsaid. She felt it pressing against her chest, heavy with questions she had been too afraid to ask. The settlers would come with dawn, and when they did, everything would change. She knew it. He knew it. And neither of them could run from it. When the first light broke, it came not with peace, but with the thunder of hooves. The riders swept across the horizon like a storm of dust and noise, their shouts echoing across the plains. She stood, her heart pounding, her knife clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. Fear surged through her, but so did something else resolve. She had run from too much already, from her past, from her vow, from the truth she carried inside her. She would not run again. The Apache warrior stepped forward, his figure strong against the rising sun, his presence steady as stone. She knew in that moment he would fight not just for survival, but for her. The battle was fierce. The settlers came in numbers greater than before, their rifles firing, their voices thick with anger and greed. But the warrior moved with a grace born of years on the land, his spear cutting through the chaos, his strength unshaken. She fought beside him, her knife flashing in the morning light, her body trembling but her spirit unyielding. Each moment felt stretched thin, every breath a thread between life and death. The sound of steel striking steel, the cries of horses, the shouts of men filled the air until it seemed the world itself was nothing but noise and fire. At last the settlers broke. Defeated, they scattered, their curses lost to the wind as they fled across the open land. Silence fell, heavy and raw, broken only by the pounding of her heart. She stood gasping, her knife slick, her body trembling with exhaustion. The warrior stood near, his chest heaving, his eyes still burning with the fire of battle. And in that silence, something inside her shifted. Her vow, the one she had sworn so long ago, the one she had carried like armor, felt suddenly small. It had kept her alive, yes, but it had also kept her apart from the world, from others, from herself. And now, with the prairie around her scarred by fire and blood, She realized she could not carry it any longer. She turned to him, her throat tight, her chest aching. For the first time, words came. She told him of her vow, of the promise she had made to never give herself, to never let her heart be taken. She spoke of the fear that had driven it, the loss that had carved it into her soul. Her voice broke as she confessed the truth that it had protected her, but it had also caged her. And as the words spilled out, she felt the weight lift, leaving her raw and bare. She waited for judgment, for silence, for rejection. But he only looked at her, steady and unflinching, his gaze carrying both strength and understanding. He did not need to speak. His silence was enough. It told her she was seen, not just for her vow, but for everything she had survived. The days that followed carried a quiet healing. The prairie, scarred though it was, began to breathe again. Grass lifted its head from the earth, the sky stretched wide and endless, and the wind carried the promise of renewal. She and the warrior traveled together now, not as shadows circling one another, but side by side. Their steps matched, their silences no longer heavy, but filled with ease. She learned to read him in ways beyond words, the tilt of his head, the set of his shoulders, the patience in his eyes. And in turn she let him see her as she truly was, unguarded, unbroken, free. She came to understand the depth of his life, through fragments of story, through moments by the fire. She glimpsed the struggles of his people, the battles fought not just with settlers but with time itself. She saw the pride he carried, the loyalty to the land, the sorrow of knowing change was sweeping across the prairie whether they wished it or not. And in those moments, she realized her vow had never been about denying love, had been about fearing loss. Yet loss was woven into life itself, and to hide from it was to hide from living. In his presence, she found not just protection, but purpose. The settlers did not return. Perhaps fear had driven them away, or perhaps the prairie itself had claimed its due. It did not matter. What mattered was the life that stretched before her now, untethered by old promises, open to something greater. She no longer carried the vow like armor. Instead, she carried the memory of it as a reminder of where she had been, and of the strength it had taken to let it go. The warrior did not demand her heart. He did not claim it with force. He simply walked beside her, and in doing so, she gave it freely. As seasons turned, the prairie changed. Spring brought blooms of wildflowers across the open land, their colors fierce against the green. Summer carried heat that burned but also nourished. Autumn painted the grasses gold, and winter wrapped the earth in silence. Through it all, they endured together. There were challenges still, days of hunger, nights of cold, moments when the world pressed hard against them. But she no longer faced them alone. And in that, she found a peace deeper than any vow could give. In time, she came to see the land not as a place of exile, but as home. The wide skies, the restless winds, the endless grasses became part of her. And he, bound to the earth as he was, became part of her too. She had feared giving herself, feared the breaking that might follow. But in giving herself now, she did not lose. She gained strength, belonging, a love that did not confine her but set her free. Looking back, she understood the meaning of her journey. The vow had been necessary once, a shield against a world too cruel to face bare. But the prairie had taught her something greater, that to live was to risk. To open herself to both pain and joy, to surrender not to weakness, but to trust. The Apache warrior had not stolen her heart, as she once feared. He had shown her it was hers to give, and in giving it, she became more than she had ever been. And so the story ended where it had begun. On the wide open prairie, beneath a sky that stretched without end, she stood with him, the wind in her hair, the sun warm on her skin, her heart no longer bound by old promises. She had found strength in solitude, but in him she found something greater, strength in connection. The vow was broken, but in its place, something stronger had been built. A bond not of fear, but of choice. A love born not from possession, but from freedom. The prairie whispered around them, alive with its endless song. She listened, and for the first time she felt no fear, no weight, no walls. only peace. And with the warrior at her side, she knew the journey ahead, whatever storms it might bring, would be hers to face, fully and freely, at last top of form, bottom of form.